The moment a dying father's children stood in his hospital room talking about property instead of love, I think something in that family broke for good. If you believe stories like this can help us see people, pain, and family a little more clearly, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss the conversations that might stay with you long after the episode ends. I'm Ray, and today's story is about a woman who spent 20 years trying to love a family that never truly accepted her, only to learn at the very end that kindness doesn't always come from blood.
My husband died after 3 years of battling lung cancer, but what I can't forget isn't his death. It's the way his own children seemed like they'd been waiting for that day to come. That sounds cruel, I know. But if you had been in my shoes, if you had lived long enough to watch illness wear a person down day by day, to watch a man who used to be strong, who used to do everything for himself, slowly learn how to breathe through pain, learn how to accept becoming weaker, and then, through all of that, watch the children he loved be almost nowhere to be found, then you would understand why I say that. I was by his side through all 3 of those years. I was the one sitting next to his hospital bed whenever he coughed so hard he couldn't finish a sentence. I was the one who remembered the appointments, the medicine, the exact times his pain would hit during the day. I was the one waking up in the middle of the night just because I heard him breathing harder than usual. I was the one watching him lose his strength little by little, while still trying to help him hold on to the last scraps of dignity of a man who never wanted to become a burden. And his children? They weren't there. Not in the way a father deserves to have his children beside him. And then when he died, when it was all over, when the house still smelled like funeral flowers, the first thing they cared about wasn't whether he had been in pain, not what his final days were like, not how I had managed to hold everything together for those 3 years. The first thing they wanted to know was how much he had left behind. I still remember exactly how I felt in that moment. Not shocked, not hurt, sick to my stomach. Because by then, I finally understood something. Some people don't wait for you to recover. They just wait until you can't speak anymore. And if you want to understand why I made the final decision I made, then I probably have to start at the beginning. 20 years earlier, from the day I stepped into that marriage with all the sincerity of a woman who believed that if she was good enough, patient enough, loving enough, then even a broken family could learn how to piece itself back together. That's what I believed. I believed it for a long time. And I was wrong. Did I get married at 55? No. I was much younger than that then, and so was he. We had 20 years of marriage before he died. When I married him, he already had 2 children from his previous marriage. They were just entering their early teen years at the time. I also had a daughter of my own, only 7 years old. We never had any children together. Honestly, I didn't go into that marriage with some rosy fantasy in my head. I knew a blended family with children on both sides wasn't going to be easy. I knew kids can have a hard time accepting someone new. I knew I would have to be more patient than most people, gentler than most people, and put up with more than an ordinary wife ever would. But I thought I could do it, because I loved my husband, and because I believed the children, no matter how resistant they are at first, will eventually feel who is truly sincere with them. So I tried. And I don't mean I tried halfway. I don't mean I just went through the motions. I truly tried to treat his two children like my own. I learned how to cook the foods they liked. I remembered birthdays, important school dates, asked about their friends, their grades. I paid attention to the little things, the kinds of things a woman does when she wants a child to feel welcomed in her home. I never forced them to call me mom. I never demanded that they love me. I only hoped that over time they would become less guarded, less cold, less likely to see me as someone who had barged into the middle of their lives. But that house taught me something very early on. There are places you can live in for years, clean, cook in, care for the people inside, and still never truly be seen as someone who belongs there. I was that woman. On the surface, we still looked like a family. There were dinners, holidays, school mornings, work mornings, laundry to do, bills to pay, all the little everyday things of married life that look just like everyone else's. But underneath everything that looked normal was a crack that stretched from one year to the next. I felt it in their eyes, in their voices, in the way my husband's children never really looked at me like family. I don't know what they heard from their mother, from other people, or whether it simply came from their own anger. All I know is that from the beginning, I walked into that house with a sentence already hanging over my head. And no matter what I did, that sentence was never going to be lifted. I think the real bitterness started when they realized I didn't work outside the home. I chose to stay home and raise my daughter. That was my personal decision. I never thought there was anything shameful about a woman wanting to spend time raising her child if she had the means to do it. But in my husband's children's eyes, that could only mean one thing: that I was a freeloader, that I married their father for money, that I was a gold digger. From then on, I started hearing that word more and more. At first, it came as those half-joking comments that still stick in you like thorns. Then later, they stopped even trying to hide it. They said it outright. One time, I was walking past the hallway and heard his son telling his sister that their dad had to be stupid if he believed I loved him for any reason other than money. Another time, his daughter looked at me with this mocking expression and said, "A woman who doesn't work, like me, only has one way to live that well." They didn't even lower their voices. Maybe they wanted me to hear. And I did. You know what hurts the most? It's not being misunderstood. It's being misunderstood in the filthiest way possible, for years, by children you are still trying to love. I never took my husband's money. Truth is, I never needed his money. My grandparents were well off. When they passed away, they left me a pretty large inheritance. Not the flashy kind of rich, but enough for me to live comfortably. Enough for me to have choices in my life. I lived below my means. I didn't like showing off. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I could stay home and raise my daughter because I could afford to. But I never told my husband's children that, and I told my husband not to tell them either. I didn't want them changing their attitude toward me one day just because they found out I had money. I didn't want any kindness from them to come from the possibility that one day they might benefit from me. If they ever opened their hearts to me, I wanted it to be because they believed I was genuine with them. Years later, I finally understood, maybe from the very beginning, I had been hoping for the wrong thing from the wrong people. Because instead of softening over time, their contempt only became more obvious. The label gold digger wasn't some passing insult they threw at me in anger. It was how they saw me. It was the story they told about me. It was the lens through which every single thing I did got twisted into something fake, calculated, and low. If I cooked, I was putting on a show. If I cared, I was pretending. If I stayed quiet, I was being sneaky. I think when someone has already decided not to see you with their heart, then it doesn't matter how decently you live. In their eyes, you are only ever what they want to believe. And to my husband's 2 children, I was a woman who came for money, even though that was never the truth. There's one moment I remember vividly. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can still see every detail of that night. It was my husband's oldest son's birthday. I had started preparing dinner early. I cooked the dishes he liked, baked a cake, set the table carefully. I knew he didn't care for me. I knew everything I did for him might mean absolutely nothing to him. But he was still my husband's son. And back then, I still believed that if I could keep trying, then I should. I remember standing in the kitchen for a long time. The smell of food, the sound of the oven, the clinking of dishes. All those little ordinary things, so familiar to women who spend their youth taking care of other people. I thought, at the very least, tonight should stay peaceful. But I gave that child way too much credit for kindness when he had never once seen me as family. He had a few friends over. At dinner, everything seemed normal at first. I even thought maybe I had worried too much. Then suddenly, right in front of everyone, he turned to me and said something I don't think I'll ever forget as long as I live. He told them not to let my sweet act fool them. He said I behaved like that house belonged to me, when really the only reason I got through the door was because I knew his father had money. Before I could even react, his sister laughed. A cold laugh. Then she chimed in with something along the lines of how I was basically just a live-in maid with a wedding ring. Some humiliations don't come from someone hitting you. They come from being made to stand still in a room and feel like every bit of your dignity has been stripped off in front of strangers. I stood there, still holding the cake knife. No one said a word. His friends looked down at the table, embarrassed. The air got so thick, it felt hard to breathe. I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest. My husband got angry immediately. He shouted and demanded that both of them apologize. But what good is an apology after words have already left someone's mouth, already landed on the dinner table, already sat there like something filthy no one can pretend not to see? His son showed no remorse at all. He even slammed his fork down on the table and said if I couldn't handle the truth, then I shouldn't be there. I didn't cry, at least not then. I still cut the cake, still handed out slices, still cleared the plates after the guests left, still picked up the torn wrapping paper, wiped down the table, packed up the leftovers. I did it all like a machine. That night, once I went into the bathroom and shut the door, I turned the water on full blast so no one would hear me crying. But the next morning, I still got up early and made breakfast like I always did. Sounds stupid, doesn't it? Maybe it was. But back then, I still believed there would come a day when they would grow up. A day when they would look back and understand how cruel they had been. I was wrong. Some people grow older, but their compassion never grows with them. After that dinner, my husband told me he was so sorry. He sat on the edge of the bed with his head lowered, his hands clasped so tightly together. I knew he was hurting. Not just because of the way his children had treated me, but because of a very private kind of pain a father feels when he has to face something he never wanted to believe, that his own children could become that cruel. He told me he would never let it happen again. I believed he meant that, but I also knew there are some things you can't fix with a few harsh words or one stern talk in the living room. Contempt, once it has taken root deep enough in someone, doesn't disappear just because an adult tells it to. I could have given up then. I could have pulled back, stopped trying, told myself I didn't owe those two children one more ounce of kindness. But I didn't. That was probably the weakest part of me, or maybe the best part. Even now, I'm still not sure. I kept living like a woman trying to keep her family from falling apart. I kept cooking, kept asking about them, kept caring for them the way a stepmother does when she is never once called Mom. I told myself children are sometimes more vicious with their mouths than they realize. I told myself divorce, a broken home, a father remarrying. Maybe all of that had left wounds in them I couldn't see. I told myself that if I stayed patient long enough, one day they would understand. I think a lot of women like me live off those kinds of things we tell ourselves. We endure longer than we should, not because we're stupid, but because we keep hoping kindness will eventually be recognized. But life doesn't always reward kindness. Sometimes life is just seeing how long you can take it before you finally break. I remember those years as a long road with no response at the end of it. The more I tried to step toward them, the more they stepped away. The gentler I became, the more they saw it as weakness. The quieter I stayed, the more they took it as proof that I deserved to be treated that way. And what hurt the most was that even though my husband always stood by me, he still couldn't force his children to have a heart. He could make them shut their mouths, make them apologize, keep them from crossing the line when he was around. But he couldn't make them truly feel sorry. An apology without a soul is just noise. I lived with that noise for years. Looking back, I think that was the stretch of time that exhausted me in a way that's hard to put into words. Not the kind of exhaustion that comes from working too much. The kind that comes from having to convince yourself every single day that loving someone hopelessly is still worth doing. I did that for far too long. And then, years later, just when it felt like things couldn't possibly get any worse, illness came crashing in. And that was when I truly saw who people are when they're standing in the face of life and death. For years, I let my husband's two children believe I was a woman who had nothing except the husband she married. I never corrected them. I never sat them down and told them that before I ever met their father, I already had enough to live a peaceful life. I never laid my inheritance papers out in front of them. I never told them that if I walked out of that house tomorrow, I still wouldn't need a single dime from their father to survive. I stayed quiet, partly out of pride, partly out of foolishness, and partly because I didn't want money to be the only thing that changed the way they treated me. My husband knew all of it. He knew my grandparents had left me a fairly large inheritance. He knew I lived frugally because that's just the kind of person I am, not because I didn't have money. He knew I chose to stay home and raise my daughter because I wanted to raise her with my own hands, not because I was clinging to him. One time he asked me, almost pleading, whether we should tell his children the truth. He said maybe if they understood that I didn't need his money, they would stop looking at me like I was some opportunist. I shook my head. I remember that night very clearly. We were sitting at the kitchen table. It was dark outside, yellow light overhead. A completely ordinary scene, but the conversations people remember forever usually happen in the most ordinary moments. I told him I didn't want any kindness from them that came from the idea that someday I might leave something behind for them. If they were ever going to accept me, I wanted it to be because they saw me for who I was, not because of the number in my bank account. He looked at me for a long time, with a look that held both tenderness and helplessness. Looking back now, I don't know whether that was the right decision or just another form of unnecessary female pride. I only know that at the time, I truly believed that if love meant anything at all, it had to be something money couldn't stain. But those two children never gave me the chance to believe that was true. The older they got, the more openly hostile they became. Their disrespect was no longer just a few impulsive jabs from adolescence. It became the way they treated me every day, as if I were something beneath them, as if my being in that house was an intrusion they were forced to tolerate. My husband saw all of it. At first, he tried explaining, tried being gentle, tried convincing his children that I was not the enemy. Then he became stricter. There were times when he got truly angry, the kind of anger I rarely ever saw in him. But as time went on, I realized there was something in his eyes beyond anger. It was disappointment, a heavy, sorrowful kind of disappointment. Because every man eventually reaches the point where he has to accept something painful. There are children he brought into this world, and yet he no longer recognizes them. When his son was getting ready for college, money became an even bigger sore spot. Those two children always assumed their father would pay for everything. Maybe because they had grown up thinking the world was supposed to clear a path for them. And maybe because it had never crossed their minds that one day the way they treated other people might come back to collect. I know my husband thought about it for a long time before making his final decision. He didn't say much to me at first, but I could see it in the way he paced around his study late at night, in the way he sat for hours staring out the window, in the way he looked drained every time another letter came from the school. Then one evening, he told me he was not going to pay their college tuition. I was stunned. I won't deny that part of me felt this was the consequence of years of the way they had treated us. But my first feeling wasn't relief. It was worry. That vague kind of worry every woman in a household understands. Once money enters the picture, there's no coming back from it. I tried to talk him into reconsidering. I said, no matter what, they were still his children. I said youth can be reckless, rude, even awful. But education shouldn't be the thing that gets cut off because of a war inside the home. I said that not because those two children deserved it, but because I knew that in the end, the one who might hurt the most would still be him. But he just sat there in silence, rubbing his hands together, not looking at me, but at the table. And then he said, in a voice so tired it hurt to hear, "I could handle them hating me," he said, "but I can't handle them humiliating you and then acting like nothing happened." I didn't know what else to say. In the end, he kept his decision. Their biological mother couldn't afford their tuition, so both of them had to take out student loans. From that moment on, the relationship between him and his children was almost completely shattered. But what hurt me most was this. Instead of facing the truth that their own behavior had pushed things to this point, they chose the easiest thing to do. They put all the blame on me. I became the perfect excuse for every failure and every ounce of resentment they carried. We were no longer living under the same roof, but they still found ways to drag me into their bitterness. Every now and then, the phone would ring, and from the very first hello, I could already tell the person on the other end wasn't calling to check on their father. One time, on my birthday of all days, the landline rang in the afternoon. I thought it was my daughter calling. I still remember how I smiled as I walked over to pick it up. That natural little smile a woman has when she thinks maybe, at the very least, there's a warm word waiting for her today. But it was my husband's daughter. Her voice was ice cold, no small talk, no going around in circles. She said she was only calling to make sure I understood that everything turning out this way was my fault. She said her father had been willing to pay for their future until I came along. She said I had ruined their family and then had the nerve to play the victim. I just stood there. I think the cruelest words don't always have to be shouted. They can be said very calmly, very evenly, very clearly, and that somehow makes them even colder. Then I heard some shuffling, the sound of them grabbing the phone from each other, and his son cut in. He told me to enjoy that house while I still could. He said every dollar his father had wasted on me should have belonged to them. Then they hung up. I was still standing there, the receiver in my hand, and it felt like someone had just opened a door in the middle of my chest and let winter come rushing in. When my husband came in from the yard, he took one look at my face and knew something had happened. He asked who had called. I lied and said it was a wrong number. I didn't want him hurting any more than he already was. But that night, while I was cleaning up the kitchen, the answering machine beeped to let us know there was a new voicemail. I hadn't even gotten to it in time to turn it off when his son's voice filled the whole kitchen. He had left a message that, even now, I still wish I had never had to hear. Same tone, same words. Blame, humiliation, resentment, and money. My husband stood right there and listened to all of it. He didn't say a word during the message. He just stood there, completely still. When the voice on the machine finally stopped, he walked over, took off his glasses, set them on the table, then sat down in the chair, like his whole body had suddenly become much heavier. I don't know how to describe the look on his face in that moment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't exactly sadness either. It was more like a man finally seeing with his own eyes the thing he had spent years trying to deny. I walked over and put my hand on his shoulder. He didn't look at me. He just said, very quietly, almost like he was talking to himself, "I thought they'd grow up eventually." I didn't answer, because sometimes in a marriage, there are pains no comforting words can touch. All you can do is sit beside each other, and admit that some cracks have gone too deep, and neither of you has the strength left to pretend they were never there. After that, our house got quieter, but it was the kind of quiet that wears you out. No more footsteps in the hallway, no more daily arguments, no more heavy dinners where somebody looked at somebody else like the enemy. But there was nothing left to hope for either. I think it was in that silence that my husband visibly aged. He never said it, but I knew his children were breaking his heart. Every father carries some soft place inside him that not even the deepest hurt ever fully kills. No matter how disappointed he was, no matter how angry, no matter how ruined the relationship had become, he was still their father. And that was exactly why every cold thing they did hurt him even more. Then he started coughing. At first, it was just a few coughing spells that lasted longer than usual. The kind people brush off as weather, age, some stubborn cold. He was never the kind of man who liked complaining. If something hurt, he'd say he was fine. If he was tired, he'd say he probably just hadn't slept well. But the cough didn't go away. It got deeper, heavier. Some nights he would sit bolt upright in bed, coughing until his face turned red. I'd bring him water, rub his back, tell him we were going to the doctor in the morning. He'd nod, but it was that kind of nod men give sometimes, just to keep their wives from worrying, while still thinking, it'll probably go away on its own in a few days. It didn't go away. He started getting tired. He had to stop halfway up the stairs. He ate less, lost weight. There were afternoons when I'd look at him sitting in his chair, eyes closed, shoulders heavy, and I'd feel fear in a way I didn't dare name out loud. Then came the appointments, the waiting rooms, the tests, the doctors' faces, always trying to stay calm, that unmistakable hospital smell, clean, cold, and somehow making you feel small. I sat beside him through every bit of it, holding his hand when he needed it, staying quiet when he needed that instead, while inside I felt like every nerve in me had been pulled tight. When the doctor said it was lung cancer, it felt like the sound around me suddenly moved far away. I could still see my husband's lips moving. I could still see the doctor explaining things. I could still see the white fluorescent lights above us. But everything felt like it was behind a pane of glass, and it took me a few seconds to understand that our life had just been split into two halves, before that day and after that day. My husband sat up very straight when he heard the diagnosis. That's the first thing I remember. He had always been the kind of man who tried to hold himself with dignity, even when the truth hit like a hammer. He nodded, asked a few short questions, thanked the doctor politely. But I saw his hand. It was trembling just a little, very slightly. Someone else might not have noticed, but I was his wife. I noticed. On the drive home, we barely spoke. I was driving. He sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window like he was trying to memorize something. The trees along the road, the cars passing by, the guy of a day that had been ordinary in every other way. I remember thinking that when someone has just found out they're carrying a disease that might kill them, even the most ordinary things in the world suddenly start to feel fragile. That night, I lay beside him and couldn't sleep. I listened to him breathe. Just breathe. Something I had never once thought would become so precious to me. I don't know when I finally drifted off. I just remember that right before dawn, I turned over and saw that he was still awake. He was lying there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. I asked him if he was in pain. He shook his head. Then, after a very long silence, he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, I'm not as afraid of dying as I am of leaving you here alone. I turned my face away right then, because I knew if I looked at him for even one more second, I would burst into tears. And when illness enters a home, you learn very quickly how to hold your tears back, because both of you understand there are still far too many bad days ahead, and tears cannot be the thing you spend all at once on the very first night. The 3 years after that were the longest years of my life. People talk about sickness using words that sound brave. Fight, stay strong, don't give up. But real life is not that heroic. Real life is coughing fits so hard your shirt sticks to your back with sweat. It's medicine bottles lined up across the kitchen table. Alarm clocks set just to remind you when it's time for another dose. It's sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for the nausea to pass. It's waking up in the morning and needing a few seconds to remember that the normal life you used to have is gone. I took him to every appointment, learned how to read the look in a doctor's eyes before they even spoke, learned how to pretend to be calm when the results weren't good, learned how to help him stand when his legs were no longer steady, learned how to wash a man who had once been so proud without making him feel humiliated by his own weakness. There were nights when he couldn't lie down because he couldn't breathe, so he would just sit, propped up against the headboard, eyes closed, trying to doze in that half-sitting, half-waking position. I'd sit beside him, my hand on his arm, unable to do anything except be there. That kind of helplessness wears a person down. Not the loud, dramatic kind. The slow, steady kind of helplessness that drags on day after day until it becomes the background rhythm of your life. My daughter came by when she could. She genuinely cared about him, but she had a job, her own life, and I never once expected her to put everything on hold and live inside our pain with us. I was simply grateful every time she came, every time she sat by his bed and asked how he was doing, every time she held me a little longer than usual before leaving. As for his biological children, they had all but disappeared. Every now and then I still called them. I still tried to believe that if they really understood how weak their father had become, maybe they would come. Maybe illness would soften something in them. Maybe seeing their father no longer as the strong man he used to be would remind them that they had once loved him. I made one of those calls after a particularly awful day. He was so exhausted that day, he could barely keep his eyes open. I was standing in the hospital hallway, my back against the cold wall, phone in my hand, still trying to hold on to one last scrap of hope. When someone picked up on the other end, I spoke very gently. I said, their father was very weak today. I said, if they could possibly make time, maybe they should come by for a little while. There was silence for a few seconds. Then his son asked me a question that, to this day, still feels like something sharp sliding across my skin every time I remember it. He asked, is he still lucid enough to talk about the paperwork? I don't remember how I answered. Maybe I didn't answer at all. I just stood there in a hallway full of strangers, hearing my own heartbeat pound painfully hard, and understood that some truths, even the ones you've seen coming for a long time, can still hit you one day like a slap across the face. That was when I started to understand something else. Sickness does not bring out the best in everyone. There are people who, standing beside a hospital bed, don't see their father. They see a door about to open, one that leads to assets, decision-making power, and the portion they believe they're owed. And then, in the darkest stretch of that time, something gentle arrived quietly.